Are you an entrepreneur trying to figure out pricing for your SaaS or e-commerce business? Getting pricing right can be the difference between a thriving business and a business that's about to go out of business. This episode is all about pricing strategy and how you can get it right. Please welcome Pat Meegan. Pat, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining me. So before we kick things off, can you tell us something interesting about yourself that most people don't know?
Yes, I'm an avid rock climber. I grew up in Colorado, and hanging off an edge, holding onto the rock with a rope tied to me is kind of my happy spot in the summertime.
I remember watching, I think it was on either Hulu or Netflix, The Dawn Wall.
Yeah.
Did you see that? Yeah, that
Not
was
that
inspirational.
extreme. I don't go to that extreme, but yes, same sport.
Yes, I figured you as a rock climber could appreciate that documentary.
Yeah,
But,
very cool stuff.
Yeah, very difficult. I think I tried a little bit once, and I'm like, no, I'm going to need to practice on it.
Yeah, it's a mental and physical game.
For sure. No, that's cool. All right. Well, let's go ahead and dive into your background. If you can, give us a little bit of your career backstory.
Yeah, I started out, I was back in 2006 at a company called Kimberly-Clark, but it's better known for its brands like Huggies, Kleenex, Viva paper towels, Scott tissue, and spent 12 years there. The early part of my career was in manufacturing facilities and cost analysis, and then later got into, actually worked into the sales side of things, where I was working on, rolling out price changes. It was the sales rep sitting across from the buyer, very front lines. Then worked into sales strategy and brand management, and then spent a couple of years after that. Went and taught at university in the marketing department, and then went into, was an analytics VP at a CPG company called Melaleuca, direct to consumer, and kind of helped with a lot of their pricing and research. And then from there went into consulting. So I've done some solo consulting, and then joined up with Maple Street Advisors a few years ago. Now it's owned by IGS, and I do pricing consulting.
Awesome backstory. Thanks for kind of giving us the high level. So where you're at now, you're at Maple Street, is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. And how long have you been there?
About 3 years.
3 years. Got it. And your focus is on pricing. Now, do you focus more on B2B or B2C?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's parts of B2B where I spend a lot of time, but also given my background in the consumer arena, lots of experience there on the pricing side. So we'll jump between the two, but I spend a lot of time on B2B. And we also have you have a number of people who have experience in those two sides. So I kind of bounce between.
So let's start diving into that. And before we do, I'll give context to the listener. If you're building, and I always break the fourth wall here, talk to our audience. If you're building a SaaS business, whether it's B2B or B2C or even e-commerce, this will be really important to pay attention to get pricing right. Because if you go down the road and you have to make pricing changes, that can be a bit disruptive to your audience. I'm sure, Pat, you've got horror stories
Yeah,
on that.
A lot of ways you can do it wrong.
Yeah. Right? Like you want to make sure you do this right. So let's go ahead and dive in. Where do you start with pricing? Like if you're launching a new product, where do you start?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, in fact, you mentioned technology, and I spend a lot of time in I've spent in the last handful of years, tons of time in the tech space. And but even go back to, I think some of the more mature markets like consumer have figured out is if you focus on the buyer, you understand a lot about where the opportunities are and how to succeed. So that's usually where I start. When you're looking at a new product launch, I got tons of examples from entrepreneurs to large blue chips, but when you're starting and kind of understanding the buyer, what they value, what their willingness to pay ranges for the things they get at that offering, that starts to help you understand, rather than creating a product and then figuring out the price tag, you're figuring the two out together.
So with that strategy in mind, do you kind of ask customers questions like, hey, what do you see in the product? Like where are you seeing the most value and how much would you pay for this? Are you asking questions like that to kind of give you a target to aim for with pricing?
Yep. And so there's different ways. There's kind of the direct ways that you just mentioned, but there's also some indirect ways. So for instance, if you didn't buy this, what would you be using instead? And if so, what's kind of the price range you're thinking about? Or, what are those reference prices that they are using to, because a person often is trying to contextualize this purchase into, what are their alternatives? You're trying to figure those out so you understand that context. And if it's different by different segments, that's important too. A business buyer versus a consumer for the same purchase may be very different. So you want to understand some of that context to be able to get some pricing intelligence. But then also, those direct questions, there's a really deep toolkit that you can draw from in terms of types of questions, ways to position it, ways to give people, if you're gonna ask them a question about a product, you can ask them a question about this product in light of product, A and B and C, and you get different responses than if you just ask about the product itself, right? So asking in isolation versus competitive context.
We like to get a little tactical on this podcast, and I'll kind of give you an example of what I've done, and then have you correct me if it's a little different than what you do. But what I've done is you ask customers, what other products like our product or service are you using, and how much are you paying for that? And do you find it to be in the high end? Do you find it be in the low end? And collect the data there to give you a target to aim for on how much you could really come out of the gates charging. Is that a strategy you've done?
Yeah, that's not a bad approach. A lot of times what you can do is kind of identify that baseline of value that they're willing to pay for the product category. Then you can even drill down further and say, okay, well, if that's the case, then given this product versus the competitive context, does this allow you to then move up into a higher, or do you expect it to pay a discount or a premium for this? If so, how much, and kind of figure some of that out, because then you're trying to get to how much actual value they have, and then what are some of those levers you can use to get to a higher price point and drive to more premium prices for your offering, or whether you get some really hard intel that tells you, hey, this doesn't stack up that well, and you need to rethink your pricing strategy because you're not going to get that much you're not get that much takeaway from being at this price point.
Right. I like to have a phone conversation about B2B and B2C. What I found is with B2C is you need to charge what people are willing to pay, but with B2B, you need to charge your worth. You can charge a little more, in other words. For example, we at Ticker, we're B2C subscription based. And the question is, well, how much value are they getting out of this? Well, it could be all over the board for one person to the next, but then you got to ask the question, how much are people willing to pay? And then you look at other platforms like Netflix, like Duolingo, like Spotify, and you see a very similar price point, which puts you in that ballpark. Like, okay, so obviously they know something. People aren't going to churn out at that price point. I'll just hit it right on the head, about $15 a month. Whereas you start breaking into B2B, then your prices can be bigger. You can start leaning towards or in the direction of how much value and how much value is this providing and how much pain is it removing. And then you can kind of tweak from there. So that's my high level description between B2C and B2B.
Yeah, and I agree with it. So when you're thinking about the difference between the two, you have someone who's taking money straight from their own wallet, and then versus the business buyer who is trying to generate a return on their investment or save money or something like that. So the context and the dollar impact is very different in those two settings. And so, but at the same time, all consumers are not, built equally, and they have different things they value. So there's the role of packaging coming into this too, right? So if you think about that $15 price point, there may be somebody who's more price sensitive, but is looking for more of a core offering versus a premium or ultra premium offering that can move someone up into the $30, $40, $50 range, depending on what your offering is. So spending time thinking about that beyond, kind of just what's that one price point, and thinking about how can I segment it and deliver additional value. That makes a ton of sense on either side of the coin. For B2B, a lot of times when you're looking at it, those use cases are important to understand. Okay, so in one case, say it's an education buyer versus a business buyer. The talking to ROI to an education buyer doesn't make a lot of sense unless you're talking about something like an education ROI, where it's some outcome you're delivering versus the hard dollars that someone in, say, procurement's getting because they're getting efficiencies based off of your product. So spending time understanding the differences in how people perceive the value of your product is one of the biggest unlocks for your pricing potential.
Now, let's say you come out of the gates with a price and you realize you're not getting the conversion rates, you're not seeing the growth, and you start leaning in the direction of, okay, maybe we have to do an overhaul. How do you approach that challenge?
Yeah, very important question. So what you want to do is you want to be scientific about it. The worst thing you can do is just say, let's just start dropping the price, because you're telling the market something when you're making that price move that potentially you've overpriced, when in reality it may be a different driver. So you want to go into that scientific mode and figure out, okay, what's happening here? Is it that the product isn't resonating? Is it how we communicate the product that's not resonating? Is it that we are in the wrong channels, or that that really we are overpriced, but if we're to move price? So you kind of break it into those buckets, and you go back and do some evaluation. I think the most important thing to do early on is not just make a knee-jerk reaction, because that's where you really see the mistakes made. Because you start to get a lot of egg on your face if you later find out pricing wasn't the problem, but it was how you communicated the value, and then it's harder for you to move back up. So you want to take your time and monitor some of these things, and go into, when you make these changes or launch a product, you want to be thinking about a step or two ahead, saying, okay, if this happens, what do I do? If this happens, what do I do? And then just making sure you're getting some people or some others to help you think through it, versus just making snap judgments.
And that's good to think about. What if we need to raise our prices, or what if we need to lower our prices? What a decision tree looks like from there. I always found, it's easier to lower your prices. You're like, hey, you get the same value, but now we're charging you less. We've seen that with, for example, OpenAI. They went through different updates. If you use the API, you get an email saying, hey, we have lowered our fees a little bit on your end, yet you still get the same tool. It's like, hey, that's a win. But then you flip that equation and you get that email saying, hey, we're going to be increasing our prices. What I found works well is selling the why, not just saying we're increasing our prices, but why are we doing that? And that can be, you can create less friction with your customer base, in my opinion. One SaaS platform we used just sent one of those emails, but they did a very good job of selling the reason why. And that prevented me from responding with an email saying, why is this happening? Why am I getting charged more?
It's a great point, and I'm fully aligned with that approach. And the reason why is, at the end of the day, the reason why someone buys a podcast or buys access to a product or whatever, a SaaS license or whatever the item is, or a B2B solution, is they're trying to get some form of value from it. And so going out and talking about your costs is not the way to reinforce the value you're delivering. So if you think about, okay, what are we doing with our value in terms, and how are we increasing our value over time to this customer group, and why these changes in pricing, the price value relationship need to shift, is how you should talk about it. And you'll see a marked difference in how people push back when you say, when you talk about your costs and you're saying, hey, prices are going up, but when costs go down, then suddenly people start knocking on your door and saying, hey, it's time to bring that price down. But you're missing the point, is that, hey, as our value increases, our price needs to go up with it.
Right. All right, folks, a quick breather here. I'm building my own business, Ticker, and I found that certain tools can be a game changer. That's why I'm excited to talk about Leadfeeder. Leadfeeder is a tool that helps you cut through the data and turn those website visitors into solid leads. Leadfeeder shows you what companies are visiting your site, you can track their behavior, and you can integrate that data within your CRM. The result? The secret weapon for your team and how to convert more traffic into sales. Head to leadfeeder.com to get a free demo and get a free extended premium trial when you let the rep know you found out about Leadfeeder through Payback Time Podcast. All right, back to the show. Now, what is your advice for raising prices and frequency? And I'll break this down between like a SaaS product and e-commerce. I find that e-commerce can increase prices a little bit more because there's more cost involved, like shipping and manufacturing, all that good stuff. But SaaS, I've seen SaaS products hold prices for 2-3 years and then upgrade. What's kind of best practice from your point of view?
Yeah, from an e-commerce perspective, you mentioned the macroeconomics can play a part in it, right? So you saw in the last few years, inflationary pressures made it so that it wasn't that people necessarily increased their value perception, but for the product to even continue to exist, they had to take their prices up to maintain an acceptable margin, and often they lost some margin in the interim. Not to say that you shouldn't be thinking about value there, but it's an additional overlay that doesn't happen in the SaaS environment. So on the SaaS side, where there's low marginal cost, this is where value becomes even more important. So if in the last 3 years, and we see this all the time when we're working with clients, is there has been a tremendous effort in the roadmap and improving the product and really moving up in the value delivery of that product over time, but none of that value is claimed via pricing. And so you want to be thinking about that roadmap. I like to think about it as the value or the product roadmap, and then also a pricing roadmap to say, if I'm going to invest in this and make a lot more additional value for my buyers, then it should be able to claim some of that, because it also allows you to create more of that value over time.
I love that. You're creating your product roadmap, which we do, and we're very excited about. But it's also important to think about the pricing roadmap as you add more value. You need to be thinking about what the pricing looks like from there. What I found, and this is really specific to SaaS, this is not e-commerce, but to create different tiers so you can add more products and put features into certain tiers, and that way you're not sending your customers that surprise email saying, hey, we're increasing our prices because of this. It's this feature falls into this tier. No price changes there, but you get access to it if you upgrade to that level. I found that a little easier than giving those price bumps.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to execute these kind of changes. And one general comment I'd say is spend the time thinking about the scenarios. So for instance, in this case, it may make sense to have, hey, we're going to move you to this, account A, we're going to move you to the new package. It's going to be discounted for a while so you can get a taste of these new features. But after X period of time, then you're going to go back or you can upgrade, right?
Sure.
So that can be really effective, because then they're getting a taste for what the additional capabilities are. In other cases, that kind of approach where you're going to provide them an opportunity to upgrade totally makes sense. But I think there's a lot of different tactics that can be used. In some cases that there needs to be a price increase that's taken, and that just goes back to that kind of value communication playbook that you'd want to leverage.
Let's talk about, and I was doing a little homework on you offline about value creation puzzle and prioritization. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So in terms of you think about a business at the end of the day exists to generate value for a buyer. And so when you think about going back to what I said earlier, if you're generating a new product, you can't separate the product and its value from its pricing, because like you said, product market fit is what you're after. It's really product market price fit, if you think about it, right? Because product market, people are going to accept things at all kinds of prices, but if you have no price, people are going to accept all kinds of products. But if you add price in there, then suddenly the decision becomes far more poignant, and they've got to rationalize whether it's worth it or not. And so, there's a whole school of thought around this of having the pricing logic built out and studied out early on in the process of launching a product. Partly because here's the worst case that you'll see, and I've seen it a lot of times in SaaS and other organizations, but more so in SaaS because they have a development arm that's just part of their org, and they'll say, hey, let's build this thing. But then it gets the point where they need to take it to market, and the buyers aren't really that excited about it, aren't willing to pay more for it. But you just invested a whole lot of dev capability, and you can't monetize it. So you want to couple that monetization with your product development as well.
Right. Let's say you want to get ahead of that. I found with product development is to kind of design it with customers. Like you kind of bring them into the creation of the product process. And I even start asking them what kind of value you see in this. So that way you don't get too far down the road and create something. You don't invest too much money for something that one, people don't want, and two, it's way out of the ballpark of what people are willing to pay. Do you kind of take that approach with your consulting firm? You kind of design with customers, you kind of hold their hand through the process?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, we've seen some SaaS companies do some clever things that have worked really well in this space. So for instance, one would do that step that you just mentioned, and then go a step further and then try to sell it at a few different prices to actual customers who were part of that test group. And that would give them a lot of good intelligence about how much they actually value versus what was stated.
I like that. So for an example would be, let's say you went through the process with a few different customers, and then you had a few different buckets or categories and prices within, and you'd kind of pitch the different prices and see what the conversion rates are. Is that the approach?
Yep. And then if they need to, if they find they got to push it down and what's that range where it's getting accepted.
That's smart.
right? It works really well.
That's really clever. Listeners, write that one down. That's I may steal that one myself. Cool. Do you have any, like, have you ever walked into a client situation where they're way out of the ballpark? They're kind of, like, I use the phrase tone deaf to pricing, and I'll give you two fun examples here. There's a local business I know that drastically, it's in the health and wellness space, and they drastically raise their prices. We're not talking about like 10, 15%. We're talking about a B2C play that's raising by like 100%. And customers are just kicking back. And my response is like, they are tone deaf to the market. They're not charging what the customer is willing to pay. So that's one example. Example two is another B2C play that does financial planning for families, not just husband and wife, but the entire family, and charging like an upfront fee of like 15 grand. And I was same thing. They are tone deaf to the market, because who in their right mind is financial advisor approaches you and says, yeah, to get started with me, it's 15 grand. It's like, you're good. And I asked them, how many conversions have you made? And the response, it was crickets. You're
Yep.
not right. Tone deaf pricing.
No, yeah. So the one caveat I'd say is unless they have an ultra premium strategy for their
Mhm.
pricing, which could make sense if they're going after, fairly wealthy, low, they're looking
Sure.
for a smaller segment that they're going to go chase. And there's a reason why it's positioned that way. But if they're looking for the average person, it's in the middle class that they're trying to do planning with,
Mhm.
that does sound like they're missing the mark on that. Something that I would share. So for an example came to mind is a growing SaaS company had a segment that their enterprise offering. They weren't selling much of it. They were really frustrated, and when they did, they had to take the pricing way down. We went in and did the study, and it's like, well, yeah. I mean, if you look at the perception of the products that are really garnering that
Mhm.
$1 million price point, they have far more developed code. They got a track record you don't have, and all these things. So it's like, yes, there's a place for you to play, but it's at 1/3 of the price you're looking at, and suddenly it took off once they made that move. But often the indicators are there. It's that they're not listening, and it doesn't mean that just because you have low conversion that it's necessarily price. Like I said earlier, but that listening is a critical part of kind of developing your pricing strategy.
It is. You hit the keyword there, listening. And it's, there's people out there on one side of the equation that are like, well, I want to charge what I'm worth, and I don't want to be the cheapest in the market. And that's great. But at the flip side of that, other end of the spectrum, you don't want to outprice yourself out of the market. And it sounds like exactly what that customer was doing on your end is, yeah, they were charging a premium, but they're way out of the ballpark of what people were willing to pay. So you gotta hone in, like, hit the bullseye. You don't have to hit the center, but let's try to get pretty
Yeah.
close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's
Yeah.
there's always room. I think sometimes people think you have to be at the target, the aspiration, in the beginning. There's an argument to be made, and I've seen it work many times, where you start to establish yourself in the market, and you can move up and up and up because you have more cachet that you didn't have before, and you have more reputational sway that can help increase your pricing power. But to be overly aspirational without the positioning to back it up, and without the credibility in the market to back it up, often that falls flat.
Yeah. Can you get tactical for us in this example here? Like, if I know there's listeners right now, they probably have a business that they've established their product, they've established pricing, but they're just not converting as well as they'd like. And a part of the thought process is, maybe I need to change their pricing. What should be their next steps at that point?
I would be honing in on looking at your ideal customer profile and seeing if there is actually a gap between what it is that you think how good you are in the market actually versus how they perceive you. There may be, that's often one of the issues, is that you're overvaluing it versus what they see. So setting up some conversations, kind of asking some hard questions about, if you're looking at alternatives, how do we stack up, and how are we delivering versus
Mhm.
expectations, and anything you'd change if you had a magic wand. Just opening
Mm.
that door and allowing them to just kind of riff on your questions will yield a ton of insight. And if it isn't pricing, it's something else. It's likely to come out in the course of that conversation.
Right. And do you prefer to do these over the phone or on a Zoom or even in person?
Yeah, I mean, I think Zoom works great anymore. I've seen tons of that, and I've done a lot of them too. In person, used to be a huge thing, but it's expensive.
Yeah.
If it's geographically, condensed product, if it's a service in a certain area, that may be totally viable, which actually could be the top option for it. But for the most part, if you're selling nationally, Zoom calls, post COVID, people respond to those really well and generate good insight.
Yeah, much more efficient. And then you're asking them those questions like, what other products are you using? How much are you paying? What value are you seeing? I like the magic wand comment. Like if you had a magic wand, what would you add? I like to ask a version of that question, like what is the number one feature that you're looking for? What is the number one pain
Mhm.
point you're looking to solve? And what feature would do that for you? And a version of that kind of gives you a bullseye to aim for, and then you can kind of take it from there and figure out your pricing if you compare to other products.
Yep. Yeah. And then other ways to flip that question around, things like, okay, you propose a product, and if you didn't have this product, what would you do instead? Or, what couldn't you live without? And if you get crickets after questions like that, then
Mhm.
there's something that's not striking home.
Right, right. Awesome. Hey guys, here's a quick commercial break. So, have you ever wanted to invest in the stock markets on your own? Well, I have just a solution for you. Ticker is a platform that helps investors manage their own investments confidently. It's perfect for beginners and it will save more experienced investors a lot of time. Check this out. Here's some of the key features. There's a customizable dashboard. There's also stocks, ETFs, and crypto. On the stocks page, you can search, sort, and filter by anything you want. And we have an easy to understand rating system, so stocks are either on sale, watch, or overpriced. We also have a portfolio tracker and custom alerts you can set on stocks, ETFs, and crypto. So if you ever wanted to know what stocks to look for, what stocks to avoid, know when to buy, know when to sell, and help you avoid losing money in the stock market, I invite you to join Ticker for free. All right, let's get back to the show. All right, before we transition to the rapid fire round, is there one key takeaway you can give our audience?
Yeah, I mentioned being a scientist about the whole process. Your pricing is fundamental to your business. It's usually a measure of, number of whatever you sold times your price. And so often people spend way more time on that part about how much they sold in quantity versus how they priced it. If you spend more time thinking about your pricing and deliberating about your pricing and just kind of, doing the analysis, it's going to yield an enormous amount of revenue and profit just because it's probably not getting enough attention now.
Right on. Good point. All right, let's transition to the rapid fire round. This is the part of the episode where we get to find out who Pat really is. If you can, try to answer each question in about 15 seconds or less. You ready?
Yeah.
All right. What is your favorite podcast?
The Impact Pricing Podcast. It's run by a guy named Mark Stiving. And, obviously, since I'm on pricing, he gets a lot of interesting people on there and tons of good commentary to consider for business leaders.
Love it. I'm going to check it out. All right. What is a recent book you read and would recommend?
Yeah, it's just sitting on my desk, actually. It's called Obviously Awesome by April Dunford. It's about positioning. And since I'm in pricing, it's hard or impossible to separate your positioning from your pricing.
Mhm.
And thought I'd go deep there. I found a lot of value in it.
That's another good tip. All right. This is a fun one. What is your favorite movie?
The Princess Bride. It's a classic.
Yeah. Very classic. Nice. All right. A little more serious here. What is the worst advice you ever received?
I had someone tell me early on in my college career to just get a degree in anything, and it won't really make a difference. That wasn't very helpful, but I think the principle was off. And the principle is that if you spend time and become expert in some area, be it a product or a service or whatever it is that you do, whatever area you're in, become the expert. Don't just be a generalist.
Right on. All right. Flip that equation. What is the best advice you ever received?
I think the best advice I ever received was from one of my bosses years ago, who was constantly focused on what are the steps to level up to the next level of expertise or capability or whatever. And he just always was talking to me about, if you want to get to this certain stage, what are those steps you need to make in those areas you need to improve to get there? So always kind of having that plan to just continue to grow.
Awesome. All right. And last question here is the time machine question. If you could go back in time to give your younger self advice, what age would you visit and what would you say?
I think I'll go back to 2006 when I was just starting my career and just kind of tell myself, you're better at what you're doing than you think you are. Just have some confidence and just give it your best, and things are going to work out well if you're just tenacious.
Nice. All right. And where can people reach you?
You can find us at maplestreet.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Pat. This is great.
Great. Thank you, Sean.